Hi everyone, Tracy DW here. How are you today? How have you been over the course of this week, this month, and throughout what has been a very interesting year, to say the least? At the time of creating this podcast episode, it is that time of year where many of us are well into preparations for the festive season, with last-minute preparations for spending some much-needed downtime with family and loved ones. It is also a welcome break for many of us, as we have all had to confront the complexities and challenges that this year has brought. Challenges which have left many of us emotionally and financially drained, and these challenges are set to continue into the new year. I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to all of you who have taken the time to listen to my podcast, visit the website platform, bought and read my stories, and have liked, followed, shared, commented, emailed messages of encouragement, and left reviews. I have always said that Stories to be Told is quite simply my learning journey about Britain's colonial past, and an extended invitation to you, my listeners and co-learners, to share my journey, and I thank you for staying with me on my journey so far. Bearing this in mind, I thought that since I found myself yet again with the task of releasing an episode over the Christmas weekend, last year it was Christmas Day, this year it's Christmas Eve, I decided to be a little self-indulgent this time around. Last year I focused on you, my listeners, and produced a top of the pods of our countdown of your favourite podcasts over the first season. I'll probably do a second top of the pods to kick off 2023, but this year I'm going to end it by looking back over the second season and choose the episodes that have really stood out for me. I mean, all the podcasts of special significance. There isn't one podcast that I regret publishing. Each one has its place, and there isn't one episode that I look back on and say, I wish I hadn't done that or said that, or I wish I had added this or taken out that. Each one is exactly as it should be, reflecting the time and circumstances of its release date. And it has certainly been that way for the second series. Those of you who have been listening to this podcast from the very beginning will know that the podcast itself was a result of the desire to use the research that didn't make it into my stories. The poetic narratives that I have written, which were inspired by my research and learning about the British Empire. I did have a finite number of episodes in mind. I had no intention of going beyond 20 episodes because I didn't really know if I would be able to sustain the momentum of planning, reading, editing and publishing a podcast, let alone having the time and be able to grow an audience. It has been difficult at times and I have been close to the wire, but having a consistent workflow has enabled me to manage my time and make it a priority. The very first episode, along with the trailer, was released back in October 2020, and the first series was very closely linked to the stories because that was the original purpose of the podcast, and it still is. I always draw your attention to them in the notables at the end of each episode, along with my strapline, the question, history is a matter of fact or perspective. Even now in the second and my current season, I continue to do this. The fact that I've been able to refer to a relevant story or two, or three, as well as relevant earlier podcasts at the end of each episode is a testament to the fact that all the components of Stories to be Told are interconnected and work together so well. You can listen to the episodes in any order. There is no chronology, just an understanding of what episodes are relevant and relate to each other. encouraging you as my co-learners to join the dots, make connections, and either continue or embark on a learning journey of your own. Now that it's the end of a series, the second series, come with me as I take you back over the past year from October last year to this September and share some thoughts about how this second season for me has reflected and chronicled the mood, events and times that have taken us through those 12 months. So, back in October last year, I began the second season at the start of another Black History Month here in the UK with some readings and anecdotes from 3 of the next 4 story titles. These were eventually published and released in July this year. The Journey's End, Giving Back Hong Kong, Bite from the Big Apple, A Story for New York, Hope for Zimbabwe, Arise the Phoenix, and A Story for South Africa. With Barbados becoming a republic, I decided to mark the occasion with a podcast episode at the start of December, but it was in January when I published the episode, A New Wind of Change, Adjusting the Sails, that I felt that the podcast series itself was turning in a new direction with a narrative style and format taking on a life of its own. In this episode, I shared some of my reflections and feelings about the pandemic, using the wind of change as a metaphor to explore the process of change that we were all experiencing at this time. As we stood still, our normal distractions were removed, and we all saw that which had always been hidden in plain sight: the inequalities and injustices of our human existence. As we put on physical face masks, we tore off our metaphorical ones, and we braved the uncertain and the unknown. To march, protest, tear down statues, rename monuments, and spoke with our collective primal instinct. I can't breathe. Those of you who have listened to my podcast from the first season will be familiar with the Wind of Change theme, as it reoccurs and relates to my learning journey on so many different levels. For those of you who are new to this podcast, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And listen to the episodes A Call to Action, The Wind of Change Speech, and Wind of Change Expanded. And then you'll understand why I allude to Wind of Change as a constant theme in relation to change and empire, and also how this creates a parallel with the pandemic. February is Black History Month in the US, and with it I gave my first ever interview on the US radio show Facing Purpose with the wonderful Miss Lakia Barnett. Now, I actually gave this interview at midnight UK time on the very first night of the year, and I can remember sitting in my living room wide awake. At about 12:40 in the morning, the interview was coming to an end, and the penultimate question that Lakia asked me was, "So, what do you want learners to take away or to understand from reading your stories?" I'll be honest with you, this was the one question that I hadn't really prepared for, but this was my response.
Stories really do dispel a lot of assertions, a lot of assumptions that ordinary people like myself and like you make about history that we are taught at school. And then you realise that, you know, a lot of it is not necessarily fact. It's just coming from a certain perspective. And I thought, right, that's my strapline. That is actually how I got the strapline. History is a matter of fact or perspective, because, you know, there's so many perspectives in history. We only hear about the perspective of the conqueror, of the victor. You know, we never hear the perspective of those who have gone past or those who have died and are not here to tell their tale. And so stories give that kind of balance of perspective and, just lets the reader know, look, regardless of what you've been taught in school, regardless of your formal education, quite often it's what we go out and learn for ourselves that helps us to, have a much more balanced view of the world that we live in. And, a greater tolerance and a greater of, why things are the way they are today, why there are issues and seemingly unsolved problems in certain parts of the world, and more of an empathy for, indigenous populations that are going through a tumultuous time, because we can then use these stories to really unpick and understand what the roots of these issues are. So that's what I want readers to take away.
My response surprised me in many ways, as I had never expressed my why as deeply and as profoundly as that, but it also helped to further clarify my brand story too. So I look back on that interview and say, thank you, Lakia, for another opportunity to do just that reality check that we as authors need to do every now and then. February also saw the escalation of the war between Russia and Ukraine, which began in 2014. I know and work with people who are directly affected by this war, and it is always different when you know someone from a war-torn country as opposed to just watching what the media chooses to tell you. I saw this war, as many do, as a potential threat to democracy and our way of life, and felt the need to share a collection of my thoughts. What has stood out over the last few days like a candle in the wind has been the example of real leadership that one man has displayed and has been steadfast and unwavering in. A leadership which inspires and pulls a nation together, reminding them of their collective why, determining the direction to take and the only objectives that really matter: defence of your country and survival. Such leadership isn't new. It's refreshing and inspiring to see because it cuts through the hype, the spin, the practice of avoiding straightforward questions with honest answers. But it isn't new. It is a part of our primal instinct when we are in the face of real danger that threatens the progeny of customs, culture, religion, lineage. It's always been so much more than just a fight for territory and to keep borders secure. However, I always see the importance of placing issues into a wider perspective, and so I used my next episode to make parallels between the past and present contexts of invasion and empire, and explored why certain biases exist when it comes to war in the West in comparison to wars in other parts of the world. Does the war in Ukraine provide the opportunity for Britain to adopt the moral high ground and practice virtue signalling? Over the last few days, having watched video footage on news channels and on social media, one particular interview stood out. This was with a Congolese gentleman, a student who was studying in the Ukraine. He told his account of how he, like many other Africans and Asians, had been stopped at the Polish border and told that he could not pass into safety, but had to stay and fight for Ukraine. As I began to reflect on the interview, I asked myself, whose war is it anyway? It was uncomfortable to think that, even in the face of war, such racial bias exists. But if you look back in history, this bias is supported by a long-standing historical narrative, driven by colonial activities and the expansion of empire by the West through their activities in exploring and invading of the lands of indigenous populations. The war in Ukraine, as well as other wars around the world, inspired me to create the War Crimes mini-series, a three-part episode. But this mini-series was punctuated with a two-part episode to commemorate the Platinum Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II. Through both episodes, I retained the link to the theme of colonialism and empire, but little did I know that this wasn't going to be the last time that I would be focusing on the monarch this year. On the 5th of February 1952, the 25-year-old princess was on a royal tour. It was during her stay at the Treetops Hotel at the Aberdare National Park in Kenya that her husband, the late Duke of Edinburgh, told her of her father's death. It was also in Kenya that the young princess underwent a rite of passage, passing from the position of heir apparent to that of monarch. However, it was not the only new monarchy that had emerged in Kenya. The reign of nationalism was sending shockwaves right across the African continent, where people of many tribes began to form a collective identity and unity against a common threat, a violation of their golden stool in their brutal mistreatment and the unjust occupation of their land by a foreign power. The Jubilee celebrations in June were followed by something much more sobering. Congolese Prime Minister, the late Patrice Lumumba, finally had his remains repatriated from Belgium back to his homeland at the request of his family. This was significant for me as, since the website for Stories to be Told was created back in 2020, I had always had Patrice Lumumba as a key figure on the Learning Journey page for my story, Knights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884. I felt that he was a significant figure in Congo and in Africa's post-colonial journey, and I have made comparisons with him to other leaders such as Mugabe in Zimbabwe and even the history of Haiti. The underlying narrative being that independence is often easier to achieve for a nation, while unifying its people is often harder. A popular, charismatic and influential figure, he was always able to put that childhood precocity and his oratory skills to good use, and after he spoke at the All African People's Conference in 1958, a certain man by the name of Kwame Nkrumah was more than impressed with him, and the feeling was mutual. Lumumba's natural inclination for critical thought, philosophy and poetry shone so brightly that this enabled him to transcend boundaries and speak to the hearts and minds of the Congolese. He understood all too well how powerful the writer's pen and the spoken word can be, showing complete synchronicity with the mood of the times. The time for nationalism, and he knew what made the African tick. With July and August came the end of the school year and the start of Birmingham 2022. Yes, the Commonwealth Games put in another appearance, and my friend Hannah and I had the opportunity to indulge as spectators of our favourite sport, athletics. But our conversation and focus also looked at the history of the Games and whether it was still relevant due to its association with colonialism and empire. So I decided that this was an opportunity to explore my perspectives about the Games with a podcast episode. As I watched the Parade of Nations around Alexander Stadium, I recognised that several states which had become republics, such as South Africa, Sri Lanka, Trinidad and Tobago, and more recently Barbados, were all still represented by their athletes. Hannah and I came to the conclusion that if these nations were willing participants, then the other 68 nations must be participating in the games of their own free will, and what may be perceived as propaganda could actually be pride in a legacy that signifies and celebrates a common identity and unity. We could not help but feel a sense of pride when certain countries made their way around the stadium, such as Jamaica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and other African nations such as Ghana, and to a certain extent, England. I realised that the Games were not just a celebration of sport, but also an opportunity to acknowledge my roots. And I'm certain that this was also the case for many other spectators that night. This is the one event where Britain itself recognises the ethnic groups within its own island, acknowledging its past as a product of invasion and conquest. Throughout the summer, I was also busy with a new project, a new challenge. I had accepted the invitation from my education authority, Hackney, who were looking for contributors to produce learning programmes for their diverse curriculum. Now, I wasn't sure if I would be able to do this, but I thought it would be a great indicator of whether I could expand on stories to be told with the introduction of new content in the way of learning programmes, a step on from the learning journeys on the website. It was challenging, but a worthwhile process, and I decided to dedicate 3 podcast episodes to the project. Let's Go for a Walk, parts 1 and 2, and the follow-up reflection and analysis episode, Let's Talk About the Walk. I'm not going to share a clip here, but do go and listen to these episodes. If you're an educationalist like me, these episodes are for you, and even if you're not an educationalist and you're just into education in general, you've just got an interest in education in general, feel free to listen too and join in the conversation about how we can further establish diversity across the curriculum in our primary schools. If you'd like to leave an audio message as your comment, just visit the website and click on the SpeakPipe link on the home page. I'd love to know what you are doing in your area of expertise, and it would be great to create a podcast episode with all your comments and contributions. Okay, so the summer came to an end and we were barely back to school for a week when we were all stopped in our tracks at the news of the passing of the late Queen Elizabeth II. Looking back, I was so glad to have recorded the 2-part episode to mark the Platinum Jubilee, but never thought I would end up going to see the monarch lying in state. It was an experience that I will never forget. I fell behind and allowed them to pass through as I stopped and looked at the coffin, the crown, orb, sceptre and the royal standard. I neither bowed nor curtsied, but as I looked on, I began to contemplate the demise of the monarch and what the significance of this moment could possibly mean. Apart from being Britain and the Commonwealth's longest reigning monarch, how will history remember the late Queen Elizabeth II? Will her demise signal the gradual waning of Britain's global influence? The late monarch could arguably have been the greatest diplomat that Britain ever had. She knew how to be the centre of attention without making it all about her, and she was able to make her presence felt and appearance seen without making her opinions heard. It was fascinating to witness the succession and the proclamation of a new monarch. having a king instead of a queen was also fascinating to contemplate. So much so that I decided to write a letter to the new monarch. Although he has vowed to retain the same values and vision for the monarchy that his predecessor upheld, he may well have a different approach, given the fact that he has spent much of his life being a king in waiting. This position has enabled him to immerse as fully as he possibly could into an ever-changing world, granting him the fortune to observe its intricacies, admire its diversity, and develop an awareness of its many challenges. Given this, how will the new king translate this foreknowledge into the foresight that he needs to guide him through his reign? And just like that, the second season came to an end. What a ride! I'll never forget it. That's it for this episode and for another year. Next year brings more challenges, more learning experiences, more content and more promotions. However, I could never have done this all without the support of you, my listeners, readers, audience and co-learners. I'm so grateful to each and every one of you for your encouragement, input and your presence throughout this year, and I look forward to continuing our journey together in 2023. If you liked this podcast, then check out all the podcast episodes that I have mentioned and sampled in this episode. Visit the podcast notes for the full list to remind you. And don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement, my poetic narratives. Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Knights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884 and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change are all available on the website in both Kindle and paperback formats, and also not forgetting the publication of the latest 4 titles. If you want to find out more, just visit storiestobetold.com and check out the learning platforms for The Journey's End, Giving Back Hong Kong, Bite from the Big Apple, A Story for New York, Hope for Zimbabwe, Arise the Phoenix, and A Story for South Africa. To date, I have given 2 interviews, been featured in a publication and 3 blogs, published 8 titles of my story series, created a learning program for an education authority, and produced this, my 60th podcast episode. Also, I can end this year with an announcement that I am a nominee for Best Authoress of 2022 by Aspiring Authors magazine. If you want to vote for me, visit the website and click onto the nominee icon on my profile pic on the home page, and it will take you through to the voting form where you can find me, Tracy Williams, and just select my name and click submit. It's as simple as that. Voting closes at the end of January for the general public, but if you want to vote, do it as soon as possible, and thank you in advance. And if you're following me on Facebook, the voting form is also on the Stories to be Told Facebook page. Feel free to like, follow and share us on social media when you visit the website. Just click on whichever social media link you would like to follow us on. So, for the final time this year, it is a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast series, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own. History is a matter of fact or perspective. I'm Tracy DW, and this is a Stories to be Told podcast. Stay safe, stay well, stay blessed, enjoy your festivities. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you in 2023, and I will see you on the next page. Bye-bye for now.